Investigators put a lot of time, energy, and resources into solving a case. Sometimes these investigations can cost police departments millions and still result in nothing. Luckily, the rapid advancement of forensic techniques has allowed departments worldwide to solve not just one but multiple cold cases in one fell swoop. Number 5. April 20th, 1996 was set to be a quiet day for the residents of Fire Island, New York. Fire Island sits off the southern edge of Long Island and as of 2020 had just 368 residents. Most of the activity on Fire Island comes from curious tourists who spend their time walking along the sandy beaches and visiting the island's historic Fire Island lighthouse. The small strip of land also has a park and multiple scenic areas for tourists and residents to enjoy. In April of 1996, their world would be shaken by a gruesome and bizarre discovery. As the sun set on April 20th, 1996, there was a feeling of evil in the air. Residents walking down Blue Point Beach on Fire Island were going about their evening routine when they saw something strange in the sand. A black trash bag was laid out before them. Typically, the residents would have ignored the bag and commented on the litter bug who had dumped it there, but something about this scenario felt off. They were greeted by a grisly sight when they got closer to the bag. 2 legs protruded from it. One of the residents opened the bag to get a closer look and was disturbed to find that just the legs had been dumped. The Suffolk County Police Department was called to the island, and the investigation began. The people who discovered the bags were questioned at length and were immediately ruled out of the investigation. Police believed that if the legs had been found on Blue Point Beach, then the rest of the remains couldn't be too far away. A search was put together, and officers from the homicide squad descended on the sleepy island. Officers searched through the night using flashlights and overhead lights, but no other remains could be found. The legs were transported to the coroner's office, and police hoped that they'd be able to shed some more light on the case. In their report, the coroner noted that the legs likely belonged to a white woman aged 18 to 50. While things such as height and weight couldn't be discerned, the coroner's office did find a few distinguishing marks. The woman had a 3.5-inch scar on her mid-right leg, a 1-inch linear scar on her right middle lower leg, and a 1/2-inch scar on her right ankle. Similarly, her left leg bore a 2-inch surgical scar, along with suture scars on her left ankle. Her toenails were also painted red and had recently been pedicured. There needed to be more than this information for investigators and the coroner to make a full identity, and it was similarly difficult for them to scour missing person records. Information was circulated around the island and onto the mainland, but nobody came forward. In place of a name, the woman was dubbed Jane Doe 7, or Fire Island Jane Doe. Investigators continued to work the case for several months, but with little information to go on, the case grew cold. Then, in 2010, the police decided to reinvestigate the case of Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old woman who had disappeared in May of 2010 in Long Island. For months, Shannon's family had begged the police to continue their search, and in December of 2010, their wish came true. Officers were sent throughout Long Island, with the emphasis being placed on Ocean Parkway, Gilgo, and Oak Beach. Just hours into their search, investigators unearthed human remains. The remains were determined to have belonged to Melissa Bartholomew, who disappeared in July of 2009 from the Bronx. The discovery shook the entire investigation, and the police were ordered to keep searching. Officers kept close to Ocean Parkway, and within a matter of days, they'd unearthed the remains of 3 more women. Investigators now knew that they had a serial killer on their hands, but they had no idea how many more victims were waiting to be discovered. On April 11, 2011, the police search proved to be fruitful once again, when a skull belonging to a woman was found along Ocean Parkway. It was clear to investigators the skull had been there for quite some time, but nobody connected the dots. Alongside the skull, the partial remains of another woman were found, and to this day, this woman remains known only as Peaches, owing to the peach tattoo on her torso. In total, police had unearthed the remains of at least 11 people between 2010 and 2011. The skull found in 2011 was processed and examined, but as with many of the victims, there was little to work with. It was only a few years later, and thanks to DNA, that the police discovered the skull found in 2011, and the legs found in 1996 belonged to the same person. Fire Island Jane Doe had parts of her remains back, and now investigators wanted to know who she was and who had done this to her. In 2011, an approximation sketch was created using the Fire Island Jane Doe skull, although investigators were unable to determine her hair or eye color. This sketch was circulated around Long Island and New York in hopes that someone would recognize her, but unfortunately no one came forward. The case grew cold once again, and it was at this time that the police realized they were dealing with a serial killer, one who'd been dubbed the Long Island serial killer. With many more unidentified victims, attention quickly shifted from the Fire Island Jane Doe. News companies across New York continued to broadcast details of the case, and the public watched on in horror. News of the active serial killer quickly hit the rest of the US and the world, and now everyone was watching. In 2011, forensic genetic genealogy was not as advanced as it is now, and investigators would need to wait 11 years for their big break. In 2022, police and the FBI teamed up with Othram to perform supplemental DNA analysis on Fire Island Jane Doe and the other unidentified victims linked to the Long Island serial killer. As per Othram's press release, a DNA profile was extracted from the Fire Island Doe and was submitted for testing, and within a few months they were able to track down a possible relative of the Fire Island Doe. This relative provided a cheek swab, which would be the catalyst for the entire case. For several more months, Othram and the FBI worked diligently to sequence the DNA and look for a familial link. In late 2022, the FBI and Suffolk police contacted the Vergata family in New York and gave them the news. While the family were notified in late 2022, the identification didn't go public until 2023 due to the ongoing investigation. In August of 2023, Othram, the FBI, and the Suffolk police announced the Fire Island Jane Doe had been positively identified as 34-year-old Karen Vergata of Manhattan, New York. Karen had grown up in Glen Head, New York, before moving to West 45th Street, Manhattan as an adult. In the late 1980s, Karen had been involved in a car accident which required surgical intervention on her legs. According to reports, Karen was last seen on February 14, 1996, Valentine's Day, at her Manhattan home. When she stopped contacting her family, they believed that she'd cut them off or was content doing her own things, and they never filed an official missing person report. Karen is believed to be the first Long Island serial killer victim, dating all the way back to 1996, meaning there could be many more victims out there waiting to be uncovered. In late 2023, a shocking arrest was made in the Long Island serial killer case, an arrest that we'll discuss in just a moment. Number 4. May 1st, 2010 was another working night for Shannon Gilbert. For many years, Shannon had advertised her services and company on Craigslist, and had managed to build up a steady clientele in the Long Island area. Shannon had hired Michael Pack, who acted as her driver and bodyguard for her safety and protection. Each night, Shannon would get into the SUV with Michael, who drove her to the home of her clients. Once the service was over, Shannon would get back into the car and either drive home or on to the next client. But May 1st was different. Shannon arrived at the home of Joseph Brewer at around 2 a.m. The pair chatted before heading inside Joseph's house. Meanwhile, Michael waited in the car outside, ready to spring at the first sign of trouble. According to Michael, Shannon emerged from Joseph's home at around 4:51 a.m. with a look of fear and worry in her eyes. Whatever had happened inside that house had traumatized her. Michael persuaded her to get back into the car, but Shannon was stricken by fear. At 4:51 a.m., Shannon made a bizarre 911 call in which she told the operator that someone was after her. Michael and Joseph can be heard in the background of the call trying to calm Shannon down. Seconds later, Shannon screamed and took off running to other homes in the Oak Beach gated community. Several neighbors recalled hearing Shannon banging frantically on doors, begging for help. When she reached the home of Gus Coletti, Shannon appeared to be coming around from the daze that she was in, at least temporarily. According to Gus, Shannon was almost incoherent, telling him somebody was out to get her. 911 were already on their way to Shannon's location, and Gus tried to keep her calm until help arrived. At 5:21 a.m., Shannon leapt out from the front stoop of Gus's home and ran to the home of Barbara Brennan, repeating the same cries for help. By the time Barbara opened her door to help the young woman, Shannon was gone. The police arrived 20 minutes later to find no sign of the woman. Throughout the 23-minute call, Shannon gave scant details about her name and location. According to CBS News, it took the Suffolk police over a month to connect the call to the missing person report made in New Jersey. The family of Shannon Gilbert had reported her missing in May of 2010, shortly after this bizarre call had been made. Due to Shannon's line of work, the Suffolk police downplayed her disappearance. Her family continued to push the police officers until they finally agreed to perform a large-scale search. What officers considered a search for one missing woman would quickly devolve into one of New York's most horrifying cases. In December of 2010, the search for Shannon Gilbert began along Ocean Parkway in Long Island. Investigators were expecting to find a single set of remains and bring her family answers, but just hours into their search, they would uncover something horrific. The remains of a woman were found within the first few hours. Investigators discovered the remains belonged to a woman, but they were not Shannon Gilbert. In fact, these remains belonged to 24-year-old Melissa Bartholomew, who disappeared on July 12, 2009. Like Shannon, Melissa advertised her services and company on Craigslist, and investigators believed that that's how their attacker found them. The discovery of Melissa's body rattled investigators, and they continued searching along Ocean Parkway. Within a matter of days, the bodies of 3 other women were discovered just feet away from each other. Each new crime scene came with its own complications and intricacies, and investigators desperately wanted to find the man who did this. The remains discovered during the 2010 search were identified as 25-year-old Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who disappeared from Connecticut in July of 2007. 22-year-old Megan Waterman, who vanished from Portland, Maine, in June of 2010, and 27-year-old Amber Lynn Costello, who disappeared from West Babylon, New York in September of 2010. Most of the women advertised their services on Craigslist or worked on the streets. The press dubbed the maniac the Long Island serial killer, and the hunt for him was on. People in Long Island began looking at their peers with suspicion. Could their neighbor, friend, or perhaps even brother be responsible for such horrors? As the Long Island serial killer investigation continued, more bodies were unearthed. The body of Karen Vergata, who was identified in 2022, along with Peaches Doe, her friend, and the remains of a transgender Asian woman were unearthed in 2011. Investigators have conclusively linked at least 10 to 11 cases to the Long Island serial killer, and over the years there have been several suspects. Dr. Peter Hackett had a bizarre involvement with Shannon Gilbert's disappearance, though investigators have never been able to conclusively tie him to the case. For years, the Long Island serial killer was allowed to roam free and go about his life. The people of Long Island were left terrified, wondering when and where he would strike next. The investigation into the killer had been highly publicized, and in July of 2023, the case would make the headlines once again when the Suffolk police announced that they'd made an arrest. 59-year-old Rex Heuermann stands accused of being the Long Island serial killer. According to reports, Heuermann's DNA was found on several of the victims. Not only was his DNA found on his victims, but his wife's hair was also found on at least 3 women. Disturbingly, Rex had made over 200 Google searches about the Long Island serial killer, including "Why hasn't he been caught?" and "Long Island serial killer phone call." Rex has also made disturbing Google searches of a graphic and adult nature relating to the cases and the mistreatment of the women. Currently, Rex is facing charges in at least 4 cases, and the Suffolk police are working with other officials to build the case. Rex will be held in custody until a trial date is set, and the people of Long Island feel much safer knowing that the Long Island serial killer may have finally been caught. Number 3. May of 1975 was a prosperous month for farmers in Ontario, Canada. Many farmers had spent the first part of the year planting and tending to their fields, and by May they were beginning to reap the rewards. Farmers worked the fields day in and day out, keeping an eye out for anything unusual that may harm their crops. In early May of 1975, a farmer close to the town of Castleman made a discovery that would shake him forever. May 3rd of 1975 started as a typical day for the residents of Castleman, Ontario. People awoke, got ready for work, and headed into the office. One farmer had beaten the morning commuters and was already tending to his crops by the time most people were awake. As he surveyed the fields that lay close to the Nation River, he saw something floating in the water. At first, he thought it was the carcass of an animal, but he moved closer to get a better look. According to the farmer, the unusual item was floating close to Highway 417, which lies south of Castleman. As he drew closer, he realized that he was looking at not an animal, but a human. Stunned, he ran back through his fields to his home and called the police. When the Ontario police arrived, they found the body of a woman floating face down in the river. Her body was recovered and transported to the coroner's office for further examination. In their report, the coroner determined that the body belonged to a white woman aged 20 to 45, 5'3" to 5'5" and 100 pounds. Her hair was naturally brown, but it had recently been dyed strawberry blonde. Her teeth possibly held the most information to her identity. According to the report, while she'd undergone extensive dental work, her teeth were still in poor condition. Most of her natural teeth either had or required fillings. She had a gap between her front two teeth, which would have been very noticeable. Her teeth were heavily stained, and she had partial upper and lower dentures with porcelain teeth. While the dentures she had were commonplace in southern Ontario, the coroner determined that they'd been fitted outside of Canada, opening the birth of the case. The woman bore an appendectomy scar, but no sign of a C-section scar or any indication that she had ever given birth. Notably, the woman had webbed toes, and her nails were well kept and manicured with pink or red polish. When she was discovered, she was found wearing a navy blue bodysuit that had been pulled up over her shoulders. Similarly, in their report, the Ontario police noted the conditions of the body when it had been discovered. And according to the reports, the woman's wrists had been tied with a men's necktie, while two other neckties tied her ankles together. Her attacker had an Irish toast tea towel around her neck, fixed in place with a TV cable. To further conceal her identity, her head had been wrapped in an Irish toast tea towel, two green cloths, and a yellow, orange, and green towel. A plastic curtain rod was also found under her left armpit. The circumstances of her passing deeply disturbed the Ontario police, and they set out to uncover her identity and that of her killer. In the weeks after the discovery, a clay bust of her likeness was created, and photos of this were circulated around Ontario and other Canadian provinces. The Ontario police received hundreds of calls from desperate families wondering if it was their missing loved one, but none of the leads panned out. In the absence of a name, the woman was dubbed the Nation River Lady, a name she would hold for almost 50 years. During the initial investigation, the Ontario police uncovered a vital clue. One of the neckties used to bind the Nation River Lady was a Canada tie, which bore the Canadian flag. Investigators contacted the manufacturer of the tie and discovered that the tie had been made in Montreal and distributed in stores in Quebec, Eastern Ontario, and Toronto. Just days after uncovering this crucial link, the Ontario police received a call from a shop clerk in Marmora, Eastern Ontario. The woman recalled seeing a woman who matched the Nation River Lady's description buying a Canada tie. What's more, the woman was in the company of a man that she only described as 35 years old and between 5'4" and 5'6". While details were scant and she couldn't recall the date of the purchase, this sighting linked the tie to the Nation River Lady. Despite the interest in her case, the case of the Nation River Lady sat cold. After 12 years of remaining in police custody, the remains of the Nation River Lady were laid to rest in a Toronto cemetery in 1987. Police officers who had worked on her case turned up to pay respects to her. The only indication that anyone was buried there was thanks to a metal plate that was numbered. Investigators were determined to get her name back and update her final resting place to something more deserving. For decades, the case grew colder and colder. In recent years, online sleuths, YouTubers, and true crime researchers have reinvigorated the Nation River Lady case. In 2017, the DNA Doe Project worked with other organizations to create a new 3D rendering of the Nation River Lady. This sketch breathed new life into the case, and the DNA Doe Project was confident her case would be solved within the next 10 years. As per their press release, the DNA Doe Project assisted the Ontario police with her exhumation in early 2019, so a DNA profile could be extracted. The press release also detailed how a DNA profile was successfully obtained and uploaded to GED Match and Family Tree DNA by 2020. Incredibly, the databases returned a few records within a few weeks, and volunteers at the DNA Doe Project began sifting through family trees for likely candidates. For 3 years, the case went quiet. That was until July of 2023, when the Ontario Police and the DNA Doe Project announced that they had identified not only the Nation River Lady, but also her attacker. The Nation River Lady was formally identified as 48-year-old Jewel Lala Langford, and she was from Tennessee in the USA. Jewel had a vivacious and outgoing personality and a big heart. She and her ex-husband owned a spa in Tennessee in the 1970s, and she was a massive player in the community. Even after her divorce, Jewel continued running the spa with her ex-husband. In early 1975, Jewel left the USA for a much-needed vacation, headed to Montreal, Canada. This would be the last time her family would ever see or hear from her again. When she failed to make contact or return home to Tennessee, her family reported her missing. Due to her going missing in a different country at a time before computerized records, the search and investigation were difficult. Jewel remained unidentified in another country for decades, waiting to come home. Her family filed a missing person report, and right up until her passing, her mother never stopped looking for her daughter. Incredibly, the Nation River Lady case came with not one but two successes. During the press conference, the police also announced they had arrested 81-year-old Rodney Nichols of Hollywood, Florida. According to the Ontario Police, Rodney and Jewel knew each other, and Rodney may be extradited to Canada in the coming months. Number 2. 23-year-old Laura Kempton was described as a bright and intelligent young woman by her friends and family. Laura was like any other 20-somethings her age in 1981. She worked hard during the week and waited excitedly for the weekend to come. When not working, Laura would be found socializing with her friends, visiting different bars in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. In September of 1981, the Kemptons' world would be turned on its head when a Portsmouth police officer made a disturbing discovery. At around 9:25 a.m. on September 28, 1981, Officer Gravoy of the Portsmouth Police Department stood outside the 20 Chapel Street apartment block. He was there to serve the resident of apartment 2, 23-year-old Laura Kempton, with a court summons. Laura had racked up multiple parking meter violations and was now due to appear in court. After ringing the buzzer several times and getting no answer, Officer Gravoy became suspicious. As he looked around, he noticed one of the panels on the door to apartment 2 was missing. Curious, Officer Gravoy poked his head closer to the hole, and that's when he saw the body of Laura Kempton lying on the floor. According to official documents by the DA's office, Laura's body was covered from the waist up with a blanket and her legs protruded out. Her legs had also been tied with a white cord. Officer Gravoy ran to his car and radioed for additional help. Within minutes, more officers arrived and the investigation began. Officers carefully gained entry to apartment 2, 20 Chapel Street, and once they were inside, they confirmed what Officer Gravoy had initially seen. In their report, the Portsmouth police officers detailed how Laura's body had been covered not just with sheets but also her bedding, her mattress, and the box spring. There was no obvious sign of forced entry, and the missing panel on her door would have allowed someone to slip their hand through and unlock the door. At first, investigators believed the crime may have been a robbery gone wrong, as Laura's apartment had been turned upside down and several items had been taken. According to the DA's office, someone had gone through Mrs. Kempton's closets and various pieces of furniture, removing clothing, paperwork, and other items. Red smears and splatters stained the apartment's main room, and Laura had clearly fought against her attacker. When investigators removed the box spring and mattress, they gasped in horror. Laura was nude and had suffered extensive trauma to the left side of her head. Laura's friends and family were rocked by her passing. She'd been a bright and outgoing young woman with a bright future ahead of her. She was gearing up to graduate from beauty school and worked part-time. On the morning Laura's life was taken, she'd spent the evening socializing with a friend. She returned to her apartment alone, only to be ambushed and attacked. Her friends and family struggled to think of anyone who may want to harm her, and without any physical evidence, the case grew cold. The case sparked statewide interest, but without witness sightings or physical evidence, the public had little to work with. Hundreds of pieces of evidence were obtained from the crime scene and were stored away for later use. In the 1990s and 2000s, these pieces of evidence were retested, and that's when investigators discovered the presence of male DNA. Unfortunately, the male DNA in question was absent from any police databases, and the case went cold once more. In 2022, after hearing of the success of genetic genealogy in other cases, the Portsmouth Police Department decided to upload the male DNA profile to a public genealogy database. Incredibly, it took just a matter of months for a match to be returned. According to CNN, the database identified a possible relative of the DNA found at the crime scene. From there, genealogists were able to trace the biological parents, and the parents had just one biological son. In July of 2023, the Portsmouth Police Department announced that the case of Laura Kempton had finally been solved, and her attacker had been identified as Ronnie James Lee, who was 21 in September of 1981. Ronnie James Lee had picked up several convictions for robbery, theft, and breaking and entering over the years. He had also served time for assaulting a woman whose home he'd broken into in 1987. Unfortunately, true justice could never be served, as Ronnie James Lee passed away in 2005. A sample of his DNA was drawn from his autopsy records, and that's how he was positively identified. While true justice may never be served, the solving of Laura's case can bring closure to her family, and bring hope to the families of others. Number 1. In the early 1990s, Seaside, California was known as a close-knit but tough community. While many residents tried to make the best of their situation, others were trying to terrorize them. Gang activity and violence were rife within the community, with many people joining a gang at an early age. These gang ties crossed street borders and brought violence to the doorsteps of those who did not deserve it. In early 1991, the Johnson family would be struck by the first of many tragedies, and it would take over 3 decades for justice to be served. On January 3, 1991, the residents of Seaside, California were emerging from the haze of New Year's celebrations when their joy was cut short. A resident walking near a playground in Sabato Park discovered the body of a woman lying in the sand. At first glance, her body appeared charred, shaking the resident to their core. Shocked, they ran as fast as they could, running to the first house they could find. A short while later, the Seaside Police Department were summoned to the scene, and a crowd of curious residents had gathered. When the Seaside Police Department arrived at the scene, they were taken aback at the brutality of which the woman had suffered. The person who discovered her was correct when they believed her body was charred. She had also been bitten several times and had experienced things too graphic to mention here. To investigators, the brutality signaled the victim and perpetrator must have known each other, and now they had to identify their victim. It didn't take long for the victim to be identified as 34-year-old Vicki Johnson of Seaside. Vicki was a mother to 3 young children and was working to make the best of her dire situation. Seaside was a rough town, but according to those around her, Vicki was doing everything within her power to ensure her children received a proper education and a loving upbringing. The person who discovered Vicki's body was questioned at length, and they were quickly ruled out of the investigation. According to the Seaside police chief, most of the crimes that occurred in Seaside were gang-related. Still, neither Vicki nor anyone in her immediate family had any gang ties, making the crime all the more bizarre. The brutality of which she experienced also threw investigators. Most crimes in Seaside were perpetrated with weapons at close range, but Vicki's case displayed a level of depravity they had not yet seen. According to Fox News, Vicki had fought back so hard that one of her fingernails had broken. The police didn't know it yet, but Vicki's fingernails would hold the key to unraveling her case. As Seaside had a lot of criminal activity, not many people were willing to come forward when such a crime such as this took place. Most were too scared of the possible repercussions, and whether there were any witnesses that morning is unknown. Vicki's case went cold without any witness testimony or physical evidence, and her 3 children were without a mother. While DNA testing was available in 1991, it was not as advanced as today, and databases were not as wide-reaching. What many people may not know is that Vicki Johnson is the mother of NBA star Orlando Johnson. Orlando was just a year old in 1991, and has fiercely campaigned for justice for his mother for many years. Vicki's passing was not the only tragedy to befall the Johnson family, and 6 years later, Orlando lost his great-grandmother, aunt, and 2 cousins. In the face of adversity, the Johnsons have been able to persevere and have continued their campaign for justice. Many in the Johnson family believe that the initial investigation into Vicki's passing was improperly handled due to her lifestyle. Her family has since called into question the integrity of the Seaside Police Department, who insist that they went to every length possible to find the person responsible. In 2021, Vicki's, along with a multitude of other Seaside and Monterey County cases, were reopened under the Monterey County Cold Case Unit. While much of Vicki's remains had been burned, the fingernail scrapings taken, along with her broken fingernail, had been taken and stored correctly, meaning they could be used. The samples were sent to the California Department of Justice, which were able to isolate a male DNA sample. The DNA was run through CODIS in the hopes that it would return with a hit. The entire process was not smooth sailing, and according to officers with the Monterey County District Attorney's Office, it took analysts over 2 years to complete their search and return with a hit due to backlogs and lack of staffing. After 32 years of waiting, the Seaside Police Department had finally been ready to hold a press conference. In the conference, they announced that they'd identified Vicki Johnson's attacker as Frank Lewis McClure, who lived in Seaside, California. For Vicki's family, true justice would never be served, as Frank passed away at age 77 in 2021, having stayed in Seaside for the rest of his life. Vicki was not Frank's only victim, and the police were able to track his criminal history back to 1990, when he was arrested for battery and domestic violence. Again, in 1991, Frank was charged with domestic violence, and in 1994, he was arrested for attacking someone with a weapon. According to reports, Frank was arrested on domestic violence charges in 1990, 91, 94, 99, and 2011. He'd spent many years in prison, but at no time did the Seaside police believe he was a suspect in Vicki's case. Frank was well known within the community, and this announcement shocked many. The link between Vicki and Frank remains unknown, and with both of them deceased, we may never know the truth. Orlando Johnson and his family thanked the Seaside Police Department and the Monterey District Attorney's Office for their work in his mother's case. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.